2 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the American public was only now beginning to uncover what remained hidden behind the Iron Curtain for decades through the release of a mysterious video. Some refused to believe the nation could go this far, but the images in the old film seemed to confirm conspiracy theories about officials using soldiers and civilians as test subjects. The footage showed a single Soviet Tu-4 bomber darting across a rural field before dropping a single RDS-4 nuclear bomb, which, despite weighing roughly 1/4 of the payload dropped over Hiroshima, could pack as much as 28,000 tons of TNT. Powerful enough to destroy everything within about a mile of ground zero and deliver a shockwave that could rattle the earth more than 37 miles away. Underneath, farm animals remained tied up. Personnel rushed through trenches, descending deep into underground bunkers before the payload hit the ground. The explosion shook the earth and flooded the area with a blinding white flash. The shockwave ripped the trees from the ground. Flames spread across the land, and military equipment was left in shambles. The moment the mushroom cloud drifted away, thousands of Soviet soldiers emerged from trenches, dugouts, and armored vehicles with rifles at the ready. Dozens of artillery batteries suddenly came to life. Cannon barrels swung upward in unison and fired shell after shell so rapidly that the individual blasts blurred together. Above them, military aircraft dashed across the terrain, shadowing columns of tanks as they rolled through the scorched grass and radioactive dust. What the film showed could only be described as the opening moments of open nuclear war. American officials have never seen anything quite like this. The U.S. isn't afraid of a nuclear demonstration. Between 1945 and 1962, the nation conducted 235 atmospheric nuclear tests, and at the time, the Soviets were known to have carried out at least 137 atmospheric tests of their own. Nobody could understand why or how the Soviets staged something like this, or whether any of the soldiers shown in the video survived. More concerning still is that around 1 million people were believed to have lived near the area where the strike is said to have taken place. Did the Red Army even bother to evacuate them in time? And were they ever able to return home? A Soviet intelligence officer who took part in the mission declared during a lawsuit against the Russian Ministry of Defense, quote, "On our way to the test site, some of my comrades noticed train cars filled with new coffins." The Soviets knew exactly what they were doing and were more than willing to pay the price. When Soviet soldiers across the country were notified that they had been selected to take part in a special exercise, no one thought much of it. And so began Operation Snowball. The briefing was vague. However, the mission's location gave soldiers a clue about what commanders were planning to do. Every man was to report for duty at the Totskoye Proving Ground in the southwest region of the country, not too far from the border with Kazakhstan. The land was known for its wide grasslands and small villages, resembling the terrain of West and North Germany. By conducting an exercise here, the Soviets were most likely attempting to prepare their troops for a potential confrontation with NATO, should the Cold War suddenly escalate. Personnel could tell that leaders had high hopes for this mission. 45,000 soldiers had been summoned, along with an additional 10,000 civilians who would support the operation. As for equipment, the exercise would include 320 aircraft, 600 tanks, 500 artillery pieces, and more than 6,000 military vehicles. This massive task force would be commanded by Marshal of the Soviet Union Georgy Zhukov, a legendary Soviet World War II commander who had earned Joseph Stalin some of his most notable victories against the Nazis. With him at the helm, the mission felt more like a real wartime operation than a routine military exercise. Even more puzzling, despite being provided with such a large array of military equipment, soldiers were told they would be tasked with testing a new kind of weapon, for which they would have to sign a 25-year confidentiality agreement before seeing it in action. In exchange for their cooperation, they would receive 3 months' salary. At some point, however, some of the soldiers preparing for Operation Snowball must have begun to suspect that whatever type of campaign they were about to engage in would be unlike anything they had witnessed before. People living within 5 miles of the site where the special exercise was to take place were rushed out of their homes. Those outside that perimeter were told either to leave or to take cover until the exercise was done. Crews trained day and night for weeks without fully knowing what their mission would entail. It would not be until early September, only a few days before the operation was to take place, that the pilots assigned to carry the mission's main payload were pulled aside by commanders and informed they would not be dropping a conventional bomb, as they had expected, but rather one of the most powerful operational atomic bombs in the world at the time. Still, the riskiest role of the operation would fall to the ground troops, who just moments after the nuclear payload detonated would be tasked with pushing directly toward the site of the explosion to carry out a mock attack. The plan was to determine just how effectively soldiers could carry out a raid against enemy positions after dropping a nuclear payload on them. Commanders would try to keep some troops safe from radiation by providing them with protective gear. But for many soldiers, their only shield would consist of a standard uniform coat and a helmet. It was far from a promising operation, but it was the early 1950s, and few men understood the risks. So when the order came, every man assumed his position. For a month, a Soviet bomber crew had been practicing how to drop an atomic bomb without wiping out their own army. So far, deployments had been promising, with practice payloads landing no farther than 200 feet from the designated impact location. Ground troops were located only 3 miles from the blast site. The Tu-4 bomber, carrying the RDS-4 payload, took off in the early morning of September 14th. Flying alongside the aircraft to support the operation were another Tu-4, a pack of MiG-17 fighters serving as escorts, and a pair of Il-28 jet bombers that would act as the eyes of the mission, assessing the explosion as it went off and the state of the battlefield beneath, as troops rushed to assemble their strike formations. Inside the lead bomber, the pilot kept the aircraft as steady as he could. Not too far ahead, the big white X marking the intended detonation zone came into view. Now, it was only a matter of approaching carefully. But before the bomb bays could open, winds began to pick up speed. The entire aircraft shook as a sudden wave of turbulence rattled the fuselage. Delivering an accurate strike didn't seem so likely now, but there was simply no chance of turning back. Thousands of men were already in position, and the Soviets didn't know when the weather would allow them to make a second attempt. Even more pressing, if word got out that all it took was some wind to stop the Red Army from deploying an atomic payload, America might begin to question whether the nation's nuclear weapons were a credible deterrent. And so, doing their best to keep the bomber steady, the crew assumed their positions and released the bomb from an altitude of around 26,000 feet. For nearly a minute, the weapon fell, slowed by a parachute that gave the bomber just enough time to flee the scene. In the bunkers and trenches spread across the ground, commanders received confirmation and immediately yelled to the troops, quote, "Molnia." This code word, meaning lightning in Russian, was the designated signal to let every soldier know the exercise was about to begin and that they were to brace for the incoming explosion. People in the nearby villages had been ordered to lie face down in a hole and keep their eyes shut until it was over. More than one of them climbed onto a roof to watch instead. Artillery pieces, radios, and vehicles were stored away across the dugouts, while soldiers lay low on the ground or climbed into their tanks. For several tense moments, the silence across the Totskoye proving ground felt unbearable, with no one knowing exactly when the nuclear strike would go off or whether it would fall close enough to their positions for the explosion to reach them. In nearby villages, everyone was eager to know what was happening. Nikolai Ivanov, one of the locals in the area, would later recall, quote, "We were impatient. We wanted to peek. We had a look." Many would regret that decision for the rest of their lives. At about 9:35 a.m., the RDS-4 bomb detonated while hovering just under 1,200 feet above the ground. The payload had indeed missed its intended target, but luckily for the troops on the trenches, it had strayed only a few hundred yards, sparing them from being engulfed by the blast. For a moment, the entire area was filled with a flash of light brighter than the sun. It was reported that the explosion was so powerful that the Tu-4 bomber that dropped the weapon was thrown nearly 200 feet upward by the blast wave. Sergei Zelentsov, a military officer who took part in Operation Snowball, described the aftermath, quote, "The blast cloud left its traces everywhere. Thatched roofs of several houses in the neighboring settlements went on fire because of the nuclear explosion products. The houses burned to the ground." About 12 miles from Ground Zero, the defense ministers of the socialist countries were witnessing the scene from a mountain command post. Many had never seen a weapon this powerful in action. Every animal within a 4,000-yard radius had either been taken out or severely injured. Radiation levels in parts of the region reached 50 roentgens. For reference, at the time, U.S. troops were permitted no more than 5 roentgens of exposure per year. Fires burned across the proving ground, and radioactive smoke lingered overhead. Yet the main part of the operation was just about to start. The first stage of the assault began with nearly an hour of artillery fire, with cannons sending dozens of shells and rockets crashing onto areas which had previously been designated as enemy positions. Once the initial strike was concluded, a formation of over 100 bombers and fighters took off, dropping an additional 688 payloads over the territory to secure simulated targets that had been eradicated. Throughout the aerial raid, crews were under strict orders not to break formation, so even as some of the aircraft approached the towering plume of nuclear smoke, they didn't break off. It's estimated that around 40 aircraft had to fly directly through the mushroom cloud, and while damage to internal equipment wasn't immediately apparent, it's very likely that not long after the mission, the airmen on board would begin to feel ill. However, at the time, the Soviets showed little interest in documenting the physical toll the operation may have taken on the men who carried it out. After pilots came back to the ground, they were not lined up before teams of doctors searching for signs of radiation exposure. Instead, many found themselves sitting before psychologists and military officials who were more interested in knowing if their morale remained strong and whether or not they could continue fighting after a nuclear detonation. The initial results appeared promising. After the first round of attacks, the Soviets determined that their post-nuclear strike had wrecked about half of the total of simulated enemy positions across the terrain and wiped out about 1/4 of the mock rival troops. With the traditional barrage concluded, it was time for the infantry to move. By the time troops began to emerge from their dugouts, they could still see the mushroom cloud rising in the distance, climbing well above 20,000 feet, or about 14 times the height of the Empire State Building. Circling around it was a set of Li-2 propeller aircraft sent to monitor the strike and report back on the direction the radioactive smoke was heading. In theory, this would allow crews to know which areas were most dangerous as they carried out their mock assault and how best to avoid them during the mission. In reality, no man could escape the lethal radiation spreading across the field. Even those troops who had been provided with gas masks struggled to keep their gear on, as, according to reports, the day had become so hot that it was impossible to take a couple of steps without feeling as if they were being asphyxiated. More than one soldier opted to remove his mask, and realizing he wasn't immediately feeling ill, proceeded to march as close to 1,300 feet from Ground Zero, while leading columns of armored carriers and tanks. Sergei Zelentsov remembers how, upon reaching the site of the explosion, it almost seemed like being on a different planet. Nothing but the marching soldiers moved through the wasteland, and the only sound was their radiometers going off, as systems detected radiation levels accumulating around the troops. He would later recall, quote, "Directly in the zone, adjacent to the hypocenter of the explosion, the ground was covered with a thin glassy crust of melted sand, crunchy and breaking underfoot, like thin ice on spring puddles after a night frost. And there were no footprints on it, except for my own. It's estimated that about 3,000 men were tasked with crossing over the blast zone, and while officials had provided some of these troops with special suits, gloves, and capes to diminish the radiation they would be exposed to, there were no set protocols to keep personnel safe. In fact, it has been reported that after the operation concluded, the soldiers weren't required to change their clothing or leave their weapons behind, carrying contamination back to base and remaining exposed to it for an undisclosed amount of time. And it wasn't only the soldiers who entered the radioactive blast zone who were at risk of becoming sick. The villagers in the vicinity who had remained at home during the nuclear detonation and had climbed onto their roofs to witness the explosion would soon report health issues. Some of them even began to notice their eyesight gradually deteriorating until they were left completely blind. But once again, the Soviets were less concerned with the condition of those participating in the operation or the civilians around the site than with assessing the viability of implementing the principles of this military exercise in a real-world battle. It was hard to determine just how effective the ground troops sent to Ground Zero were at defeating the imaginary enemy formation awaiting them. Most of their assault was based on executing rehearsed battle maneuvers, assessing the terrain, and then returning to base. Still, when the exercise concluded, all Soviet commanders had reached the same conclusion. The simulated attack had been a success. Not only had their men survived a radioactive wasteland, but they had also forced their pretend enemy into retreat. It seemed that by all accounts, Operation Snowball had thrived, and that in the event of an upcoming war against NATO, the Soviets now had a lethal new strategy to neutralize their rivals. But if that was the case, why did the USSR never boast about this major success to scare off America and the rest of its rivals? Some local newspapers reported the test as a standard nuclear weapons demonstration, while scientists at conferences across Moscow discussed some of the results of the operation with colleagues. However, it would be decades before U.S. officials learned about the full scale of the operation, which to this day remains the only known time the Soviet Union dropped a nuclear bomb during a military exercise. For a mission involving tens of thousands of soldiers, a live atomic bomb, and one of the largest military exercises in Soviet history, it vanished mysteriously fast. It was almost as if someone wanted the world to forget it ever happened. There was a reason Soviet officials preferred not to talk about Operation Snowball, and why many documents containing specific statistics regarding the mission were either classified or mysteriously reported missing. 40 years after the exercise took place, out of the 45,000 soldiers who took part in it, only 1,000 were said to remain alive, according to some veteran groups. Many were said to have lost their lives after years of struggling with chronic illness. Some could argue that the effects of radiation on the human body were not yet fully understood in 1954. But the Soviet Union was not going into the exercise blindly. Nearly a decade had passed since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By then, doctors and researchers had already documented severe burns, radiation sickness, and a growing number of unexplained illnesses among the survivors. Soviet Union may not have known exactly what would happen to the men participating in Operation Snowball after they were sent back to their home bases, but they must have understood that standing near ground zero of a nuclear detonation posed significant risks, and still they carried out the exercise. Perhaps Soviet planners genuinely believed that a brief exposure, lasting only a few hours, would have little impact on the troops involved. But then, it's also possible that they were willing to use 45,000 men as guinea pigs to find out exactly what would happen if the USSR ordered its soldiers to advance across a radioactive battlefield. As Soviet officials began to see the long-term consequences of the operation, they may no longer have viewed Operation Snowball as such a success and decided to keep most of it in the shadows. The 25-year gag order that the troops had signed before the mission prevented them from speaking freely about what they had been through, or withheld critical information about the test. Some veterans would even state decades later that no mention of radiation exposure was ever added to their medical records, leading many men to, quote, pass away not knowing the reason why. And it wasn't only the soldiers who were affected by the aftermath of the nuclear strike. While villagers in the immediate vicinity of the test area were evacuated from their homes, they were allowed to return as soon as the test concluded. No one was told about the full scale of the operation, nor of the potential risks involved in staying in the area. Some people who lived in the area said, quote, "When we returned, the village was still burning. There was military equipment ablaze. The fire engines were putting the fires out. Bulldozers were working away. But they actually allowed us to eat everything from our garden straight away. They said, 'Go ahead, eat everything. It's not dangerous.'" Of course, that wasn't the case. Some researchers would later state that even 40 years after the atomic bomb exploded in the area, some animals were still being born with deformities derived from the lingering radiation across the land. In the years after Operation Snowball, many people living across the area would fall severely sick. Still, Soviet officials would never make public any reports linking their health problems with the nuclear test, and to this day, it's impossible to tell the full impact the military test had on the civilian population around Totskoye. While the Soviet Union would never again test a nuclear weapon during a military exercise, the nation wouldn't stop deploying bigger and far more powerful atomic payloads in the years following Operation Snowball. Today, it is estimated that the Soviet Union conducted around 715 nuclear tests between 1949 and 1990, making it the second most active nuclear testing nation in history, surpassed only by the United States. For comparison, the United Kingdom, the third most active nuclear power in the world, reportedly carried out just 45 nuclear tests during roughly the same period. The most notable of the Soviet tests came in late 1961, when the Tsar bomb was detonated at the Novaya Zemlya test site in northern Russia, unleashing a fireball nearly 5 miles wide, so large that it rose to the altitude of the bomber that had dropped it. The weapon is still considered the most powerful nuclear bomb ever tested. However, as cracks began to appear in the Soviet system during the 1980s, the era of large-scale nuclear testing began to shatter. The Chernobyl disaster exposed the dangers of concealing nuclear failures, forcing Soviet leaders to become more transparent about their nuclear programs and accelerating a wave of arms control agreements. Gradually, the bombs stopped falling, and many of the nuclear secrets the nation had kept hidden for decades began to emerge. Among them was the disturbing footage from Operation Snowball, which to this day, no nation is known to have ever attempted to replicate.